How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And with NBA 2K25 right around the corner, I wanted to do my annual top 5 teams to rebuild in NBA 2K. And this year, I want to emphasize how I am creating or estimating this list. Now, obviously, all of these teams are my opinions. There's a lot of teams you can rebuild in the NBA. And in my opinion, this year, more than ever, there's a lot of very fun rebuilds to take over. So that's why I limited my list to 5, but I wanted to give you guys a few of my honorable mentions as well. And the first team, a team that we have experience with on this channel, is the Charlotte Hornets. They are led by a promising guard in LaMelo Ball who just can't stay healthy. He's been injury ridden, but last year, in my opinion, they made a great selection just going against the grain and taking Brandon Miller over Scoot Henderson. I think Brandon Miller fits what this team needs. I think Brandon Miller is a very good NBA player, and they've got young talent around them. Miles Bridges is still here. He fits the timeline. Mark Williams fits the timeline. You've got young guys. Trey Mann's only 23. Josh Green, you just acquired in the offseason, is only 23 years old. You've got a few veterans at the bottom of the roster to help develop, and then you've got a very promising rookie into Tehane Salon out of France. He's only 19 years old. He's very raw, but he's got promise and he's got potential. And I think the Hornets are going to be a fun team to potentially rebuild, but they're not quite in my top 5, mostly because I think LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller are going to develop very well in 2K25, and they'll make the rebuild extremely easy to the point where you're not even going to have to worry about getting stars because you're already going to have your 2 stars on your roster. The next team that I want to have as an honorable mention is the Golden State Warriors. Now, you might be looking at me and thinking, well, they're not exactly a rebuild, and no, they're not at the moment, but after you get a few good years, maybe still out of 36-year-old Steph, you have your young guys improving. Where do you take this team? Steph's gone. You're going to lose Draymond in a few years after his contract expires, most likely. You've got some good young pieces, Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Podziemski, Trace Jackson Davis, but who's the star on this team? I don't see any of those guys becoming superstars. Most of those guys, JK, Podziemski, Trace Jackson Davis, remind me as very good starters or extremely good role players. So I don't see those guys taking over as a star. And if you look down the roster, you just don't have the star on your roster. They've got some good veterans and some good young pieces. Moses Moody's another good guy. But like I said, nobody's going to be in the place to replace Steph Curry. So I think once Steph is gone, this Warriors team would be a really fun, interesting rebuild because they go into a bad place. You have probably a few years of getting out of the gutter when Steph either leaves or retires or whatever happens to get back on top. And that's going to be a really fun part of this rebuild. And now the final honorable mention I want to get into is the Detroit Pistons. Very bad last year, but I think they improved. I think Cade Cunningham, if he stays healthy, he'll easily hit a 90 overall by 2K25. Progression-wise, they've got Asar Thompson, Jaden Ivey. I really like what Marcus Sasser can do on offense. Sure, he's not the best defensive player, but he's a very solid offensive player. And then you also pick up a guy like Ron Holland, who is an elite perimeter defender who can hopefully develop. You bring in good veterans, Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., this team looks very good, in my opinion. Not very good, but they're, a bright future despite a rough season last year. And that's why I think that this is not a top 5 rebuild just because of the pieces they have. This team is going to be very good in a couple of years down the road once you simulate and progress. So I think the Pistons already are in a solid place, and that's where I don't want to consider them as a rebuild because, yes, they are a rebuild. A lot of the teams on my list later that you'll see, you could argue, aren't necessarily a rebuild, but this is my opinion. I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments down below because, like I said, there's way too many teams to rebuild to include in one video, so I wanted to limit it down to my 5 favorite teams to potentially rebuild in NBA 2K25. As we are now done with the honorable mentions, we're ready to get into number 5. And the 5th team on my list is the Atlanta Hawks. You're only, 4 years removed from a Eastern Conference championship or Eastern Conference finals run, I meant to say. where you lost to the Milwaukee Bucks after Trae Young went down with an ankle injury. And this team's in a very interesting position. You've got a star in Trae Young who is, he's going to carry you on offense. Sure, he's had his ups and his downs since he was drafted 5th overall in 2018. But I mean, he's had a pretty solid average every single year. 26 points per game, 28 points per game, 25, almost 30, 19 points per game his rookie year. And then his assists just continue to rise every year, and he shoots it pretty efficiently, which sways obviously year after year. But you have to choose whether you're sticking with Trae Young or you're going to move on, because after moving on from DeJounte Murray, you gave up a lot of pieces to get DeJounte Murray. It didn't work out. You gave it a couple years to try and work it out. Now you're in a spot where you can't sit around and hope that this team just puts it together like they did in that 2021 playoff run. And you just can't sit around and hope for that luck to come. So you have to make the decision. Do you rebuild or do you retool around Trae Young? Now, if you retool, it's obvious some of these veterans on the roster aren't going to work out. Some of these guys have climaxed already. They are not going much farther than they are right now. They've reached their peak. Clint Capella is a 30-year-old center. He is not getting any better. Bogdan Bogdanovic is a 32-year-old shooting guard. You know what you're getting out of him, so you really have to choose. Sure, they're good veterans. Both of those guys are good veterans. DeAndre Hunter is a good veteran who, yeah, he hasn't proved or lived up to the 4th overall pick, but he's had a solid career so far. Larry Nance Jr. is a solid veteran you brought in. But you have to choose, do you just go with this same team again and hope, hey, Trae's going to carry, we're going to have Jalen Johnson step up, we're going to have some of the other young guys step up? Or do you move on from some of those veterans? Do you move on from some of the young pieces? For example, I think Onyeka Okongwu, it's time at 23 years old after being drafted 6th overall, should be starting over Clint Capella. And maybe that's something they're going to do this year. But those are the decisions you have to make if you're taking over the Atlanta Hawks. And it only gets even harder as you look at the #1 overall pick, Zachary Richarchet, a 19-year-old 6'8" small forward from France. This guy's gotten comparisons to Kevin Durant. He's had great comparisons, but this draft is also heralded as an extremely weak draft class, and I think you've got to hope that he lives up to his potential. Do you throw him in starting day one? Do you think Trae Young can deliver the ball and move the ball around enough that Zachary Richarchet is going to get enough experience to develop? Those are the big questions you have to answer if you take over the Atlanta Hawks, and I think they're a really interesting case because you could go 2 directions. You could commit to Trae, and you could go 3 directions, actually. Commit to Trae, trade for some vets, trade for some, maybe another star like you did with DeJounte Murray, a borderline star, and hope for a playoff run. You could commit to Trae, trade away your vets, and hope that the youth can grow around Trae Young, which at that point you're kind of losing your timeline. Or you can trade Trae Young, trade your veterans, and commit to a guy like Jalen Johnson at 22 years old, who I think has a lot of potential. You can commit to Onyeka Okongwu, Zachary Richarchet. Dyson Daniels is only 21 years old. You've got a lot of options if you take over the Atlanta Hawks, and that's what I think makes them in a very intriguing rebuild. You've got Jalen Johnson expiring, Clint Capella's expiring, and a bunch of other players on expiring contracts. So this team definitely has a couple of different lanes you can take them in, and that's what makes them, in my opinion, one of the better teams to potentially take over in NBA 2K25. Second team on this list, number 4, is the Washington Wizards. This team I don't have a lot to say about. I just enjoy potentially taking over the Wizards because they offer what a lot of teams don't offer: a clean slate to rebuild. You really have no attachment to any of these players. Jordan Poole, Kyle Kuzma, Malcolm Brogdon, Jonas Valanciunas are not going to be part of your future rebuild. Corey Kispert is maybe even on the way out at some point, despite being a very good shooter. He just isn't going to develop much after a 79 overall. So you have a lot of ways you can go with this team as well. But unlike the Hawks, you have a chance to just completely start blank slate. You've got a 19-year-old promising power forward out of France in Alexander Sarr. Very offensively challenged. He's a much better defender than he is offensive player. So you've got to surround him. Does Bilal Coulibaly have what it takes to improve? Johnny Davis, do you just cut your ties and accept the fact that he might be a bust at the 10th overall pick just 2 years ago now, and move on from Johnny Davis? Does Keyshawn George have any promise? Does Jared Butler have any promise on a 1-year prove it deal? Does Bub Carrington have any promise? You really only have attachment to these young guys if you're the Washington Wizards general manager. And I think that's what makes them very interesting. You have no reason to hold on to a guy like Kyle Kuzma. You could easily move him to a contender or to a team that's trying to contend or trying to get over the hump and get draft picks and get better younger players that could maybe turn into something. So that's why I like the Washington Wizards. They're in a bad spot still, and you know, they could really use a good year of basketball, but are still, in my opinion, a long way away from being at that point. And DC isn't exactly a free agent destination, so this team is a team that you will have to hit your draft picks on. You have to hope that Alex Sarr can be a promising and potential full, or live up to his potential and full center in the NBA. And those are a lot of big ifs. But outside of those young guys like Bub Carrington, Alex Sarr, you have a clean slate to do whatever you want. And that's what makes the Washington Wizards, in my opinion, one of the better teams to take over in NBA 2K25. I think they offer a lot of creativity if you're looking for a place where you can make big draft picks and shine as a general manager when it comes to drafting. And the third team on the list, as I said earlier in the video, you could argue isn't a rebuild at all, but I think they're a really fun team to take over because they can't get over the hump. They've been stuck in a bit of a no man's land the last few years, and that is the Utah Jazz. You bring Lauri Markkanen back on a massive max contract at 27 years old, so you've got your star locked down. But who's going to be the star beside him? Colin Sexton's only 25. He still has time to improve, but I think we've seen what Colin Sexton is. He's a very good scorer, and that's about it. He's gonna, you know, he can play make to a degree. He can run your offense to a degree, but he is much more of a shooting guard than a point guard. You've got a center logjam, John Collins and Walker Kessler competing for minutes. Obviously, John Collins coming off of a few years in Atlanta and a year in Utah where he just hasn't done what you would have hoped out of him after looking very good in that aforementioned Eastern Conference Finals run by the Atlanta Hawks. But on the bright side, I think you've got one of the better young point guards in the NBA in Keontae George. He had a very good rookie season for the Jazz. He was up there in Rookie of the Year mentions, and this guy, he can play defense. He can score. I really like what Keontae George can do. So you've got a promising duo in Keontae George and Lauri Markkanen. Your main question is, will they develop? Will you be able to develop your other young talent like Taylor Hendricks, Cody Williams, who you just drafted 11th overall, Isaiah Collier, who you took a flyer on late in the draft, or Kyle Filipowski, who you also took a flyer on? And same thing with Bryce Sensabaugh, who was drafted 2 years ago now. Utah is in an interesting spot. They're not a free agent destination, so looks like they already have hit on some draft picks, in my opinion, in Keontae George and Taylor Hendricks, but you're going to have to continue to do that. You're going to have to make tough decisions, making trades. You've got solid veterans. We saw John Collins. We saw Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, Drew Eubanks is a solid backup. But do you keep them and hope that this team can put it together before they get too old? Or do you move on from them and use them as trade bait to maybe get some more picks, maybe get one really good veteran in return, or giving up a few solid veterans? And you also have to answer the question, who is going to be the star alongside Lauri Markkanen? Because we already saw that Lauri Markkanen can't do it by himself. They've had okay records the last few years, but they're not going to make a run with just Lauri Markkanen, as good as he can be. And I think you have to figure out who is going to be that number 2 guy. And is it Keontae George, or is that guy not even on the roster right now? That is what you have to figure out as the general manager of the Utah Jazz here in NBA 2K25. Looked around a lot, or flipped these two teams around a lot, the number 2 and number 1 teams on my list, because they all both have very fun storylines for you to follow. But I ended up going with this, and it's a very close. But at number 2, in my opinion, the Clippers are one of, if not the best team to potentially rebuild in NBA 2K25, because going into it, you might be looking at it, hey, that's not a bad lineup. James Harden, Derrick Jones Jr. coming off of a finals run, getting a big contract. Kawhi Leonard, Nick Batum, Zubac. You've got Norman Powell off the bench. You've got Kevin Porter Jr. trying to get back in the NBA off the bench. Chris Dunn's a solid defender. Terrence Mann. They don't have a bad team. But what are they missing? if you look at their roster, is a lot of talented youth. You've got some prospects, but not really anybody that is going to just all of a sudden become great players. Mo Bamba, we know what he is. He's a 76 overall max. That's what he is. This team is old, and they are very injury prone. Maybe you have a few years with James Harden and Kawhi Leonard of success, but are you just going to repeat the process? After years of disappointment with Paul George with injuries, he jumped ship to leave for Philadelphia. How many years can you truly get of true success? Because if you're not winning a championship at the end of the day, why are you holding on to these old pieces, a 35-year-old and a 33-year-old, both of whom are very injury riddled? And on top of that, as I mentioned, you have no young talent. You don't have a lot of promising players coming up, and you don't have a lot of draft picks. This Clippers team, if we are able to look at their draft picks, does not control any of their picks until the year 2030. Yes, they have some picks from swaps, but you're going to be getting the worst. You're going to be getting the lower of the two picks. So as no matter how much you're bad, you're not going to get your first round pick out of those. And that is a really tough thing to rebuild with. That's the same situation someone like the Brooklyn Nets was in whenever they were in that, made that bad trade for Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce. So you've kind of locked yourself up with Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, but now you have the chance. Do you pull the trigger this season and trade Kawhi Leonard and James Harden? Their value's at a low. Kawhi Leonard isn't the same guy that he was in Toronto, so what do you get back for him? What do you get back for a 35-year-old James Harden who's clearly not the same James Harden he once was? Those are the questions you have to answer, and they're not easy questions to answer. Fortunately, if you take over the Clippers, you do have the benefit of being in Los Angeles. Yes, you're competing with the Lakers, but you're still a free agent destination. But as of right now, the future is not very bright in Clipperland, and you've got a new stadium. Maybe you can rebuild and start a new era, or do you focus on trying to win one with this core and just squeezing as much as you can out of it? That just is dependent on how committed you are to the Kawhi and James Harden duo as a general manager. But I think the Clippers have a great storyline. They have an interesting roster and a very fun rebuild potential in a lot of different ways you can take this team. Especially if you decide to, hey, let's try and squeeze a year or so out of Kawhi and James Harden, and then we try to move on. But at that point, you would have to re-sign James Harden. So those are big, big questions you have to make as the Clippers general manager. They are not in a good spot as a team. And finally, in my opinion, the number one team to rebuild in NBA 2K25 is the Chicago Bulls. This team is a bit of a mix of everything. You've got veterans that you have to decide whether you want to move on from, such as Vucevic and Zach LaVine. You lost DeMar DeRozan. You're not necessarily in purgatory anymore. You're finally ready to rebuild and not be a perennial play-in team. But you also have a lot of questions on the roster. Will Lonzo Ball ever come back to the form that he was? Or in general, will he ever come back to play basketball? Outside of that, you saw last year Kobe White can be a very good NBA player. As of right now, ratings-wise, he's potentially going to be one of the best on the team. But can he be the number one guy? At 24 years old, he's a good shooting guard, but will he lead your team? I don't know if he can be the focal point or star of a playoff team at this point. Will Patrick Williams ever live up to his 4th overall draft pick? He's had a very slow start to his career through 3-4 years. But you gave him a big contract expecting him to improve, and he just hasn't done it. And you still extended him. So will Patrick Williams live up to his Kawhi Leonard comparisons? Will he ever make that jump? We haven't seen it yet, and that's something you have to focus on and decide as a general manager. And outside of that, what young guys are going to improve? Ayo Dosunmu's been impressive. Will he get better? Will Jalen Smith continue to improve after a couple good years in Indiana coming off the bench there? Will Dalen Terry have an impact? Will any of these younger, unproven guys such as Julian Phillips, Adama Sanogo have any impact on this team? You have to really answer questions like that. And also, after losing Alex Caruso, with Josh Giddey as your, maybe starting point guard, potentially defensive focal point, can you get his confidence back? Last year, guys were leaving Josh Giddey about 6 to 7 feet of space to shoot threes. So can you get him to the point where he's playing well on offense as well on defense? Because I think Josh Giddey has a lot of potential still if he's able to get back to that point. And pair him with a 19-year-old Matas Buzelis, just drafted out of Europe. I think Buzelis has potential. He's a very athletic guy, but he's raw. You don't know quite where he's going to go, and you have to make the decision. Do you, kind of like Zachary Richache, do you just throw him to the Wolves and start him, or do you slowly build him over time, risking the idea that maybe he's not ever going to get enough experience? And that's something you have to decide as the general manager in Chicago. Obviously, losing DeMar, the Bulls are fine with being bad, but you still have some big decisions to make. Zach LaVine, maybe you get his value up, maybe you trade him, maybe you keep him. I don't know the correct answer. Nikola Vucevic is probably going to be on the move at some point this season to a contender. Those are the picks or decisions that you have to make, but thankfully, as far as the Bulls go, you actually do have some control over your draft picks. You have some room to work with. You've got potentially 2 draft picks if the Trailblazers don't make the lottery. You've got protections going forward. The Bulls are in an okay spot to rebuild, and that's what makes them really fun. But once you decide to trade or keep Zach LaVine and other aging vets, I think this rebuild would take an interesting direction depending on that decision. And those are my top 5, really top 8 teams to rebuild in NBA 2K25. If you did enjoy this type of content, I plan on doing one of these videos every year with the new release of NBA 2K25 because it's a really fun idea to work with. And if you did enjoy it, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe. Let me know if you decide to turn on or rebuild, end up playing as any of these teams and rebuilding them in MyNBA. I'd love to hear how your rebuilds go if you do. And also, let me know what other teams you guys are interested in rebuilding. If you did not get a chance to vote for my MyNBA series, I'll link the poll or the community poll down in the description. Go over there and vote. As of right now, it's potentially looking like it will be the New Orleans Pelicans, who have an interesting storyline as well. But that is all for this one today. I hope you all did enjoy, and I'll catch you next time. Have a great day, everybody.
Soundstripe.